2002 to 2013. You know, you guys are awesome. We would have no program, we would have no reading, we would have no bookstore if it weren't for people like all of you. Thank you for coming. You're not going to be sorry. We have a great program. My name is Judy Manzo. I am the esteemed owner of the local bookstore, Bookends downtown. And I've been on this committee, which has been one of my greatest extracurricular activities since 2001. And to see this kind of a turnout is so heartwarming. Very briefly, the reason, or our mission statement for this whole program and doing Winchester Reads is the book has to be of manageable length and in paperback, so it's affordable, so the library can buy 25 copies. One that can be shared across our community, that promotes the understanding of ourselves, others, and the world, be relevant to the world today, and lend itself to a discussion and culminating event such as this. Each year we work hard to find something different and interesting. So now I will turn over the podium to Mr. John Sullivan, a Winchester attorney, our longtime town meeting moderator, master of ceremonies extraordinaire, and executor of the John and Mary Murphy Education Foundation.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you here today. It's my honor to introduce the author who arrived in Winchester this afternoon, and we've been with him for the last 3 or 4 hours. And that's Chris Bohjalian. And he is the author of the book that we're reviewing, The Sandcastle Girls. Now, Chris has authored 17 books that are all included in various bestsellers throughout the country. His works has been translated, believe it or not, into 25 different languages. 3 of his novels, of the 17, have already had movies made of the 3 books. This gentleman is an American citizen. His dad was half Armenian on his father's side, and his mother was Swedish. He published this book in 2012. It has won 7 Best Book Awards for 2012, including the New York Times bestseller, the Oprah Book of the Week Award, and the Washington Post Best Books of 2012. He indicates that it is the most personal book he has ever written. It is a love story in the midst of the Armenian genocide in the First World War. He characterizes it as the slaughter you know next to nothing about. It is a remarkable book for you that may have had the opportunity to read it. It's one of the most touching books that I have ever read, and it's a great pleasure at this time to introduce the speaker for the evening. Chris, come on up.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. It is a pleasure, it is an honor, it is a privilege to be here in Winchester tonight and to see so many of you here present opposite the Boston Red Sox. You really are the medieval monks of the digital age, because you still care about what words and reading in books can mean to the soul. And normally I would say, please make sure your cell phones are off, but because the Boston Red Sox will be playing the Tigers in about 31 minutes, do not turn your cell phones off, just put them on vibrate. Feel free to shout out the score periodically. I really have to thank Judy, I have to thank John, I have to thank Gail and Connie and Jerry and everyone with Winchester Reads, and most of all I want to thank all of you. This is such an honor for me. I am deeply and profoundly grateful to be with all of you this evening. I want to begin with a story that bears directly upon the origins, the structure, and the text of the Sandcastle girls. My father was Armenian, 100%. My mother was Swedish, 100%. And so while that means in theory that my mother was the odar, or the outsider, at all of those big, wonderful gatherings of the Armenian extended half of my family, the reality is that my mother was never, ever really the outsider. She absolutely adored her Armenian mother and father-in-law, and my Armenian grandparents absolutely adored their blonde, blue-eyed daughter-in-law. Exhibit A, my mother's keyring. My mother died years ago, but my father died more recently, 2011. And when I was going through all of those items on my father's dresser with which he had a totemic emotional connection, I came across my mother's keyring. Now you need to know that my mother was spectacularly superstitious. She wouldn't leave the house, much less get on an airplane, without her keychain. And on that keyring, I found 3 charms: a St. Jude medal, a St. Christopher medal, and a bronze charm of the nation state of Armenia. Now here's the story. When I was a little boy, I always grew up within about 20 minutes of wherever my grandparents lived. We lived in Winchester, outside of New York City. And on Saturday mornings, when my father was playing golf with his buddies or coaching my older brother's Little League baseball team, my mother would bring me to my grandparents' house for Saturday morning, where the adults would have coffee and pastry and chorog and tell stories, and I would listen quite contentedly. Now, at some point, these informal gatherings grew more elaborate because my mother would have me sing for my grandparents. The reason why is inexplicable. I couldn't sing then and I can't sing now. And at some point, when I was late 4 or early 5, the concerts grew more elaborate. Until suddenly, whenever the Armenian half of my family would gather together at my grandparents' house in Tuckahoe, New York on Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter, my mother would have me put on a full-blown concert. So, it is Easter Sunday, and I am 5 years old, and after church, the entire Armenian half of my family from Glastonbury, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, Long Island are all gathered together at my grandparents' house. And my mother has dressed me up for the occasion. Now you need to know that I was a fat kid. Not morbidly obese, but so fat that my mother had to buy me all of my pants at a store in Stamford, Connecticut called Greenberg's Husky Boys Shop. And still, she had to cuff my pants up to my knees. So for this particular Easter Sunday, my mother is having me sing the Herman's Hermits pop classic, I'm Henry VIII I Am. And so she wants me to look British. She has dressed me up in a pair of red velvet knickers, no cuffs, and a white turtleneck shirt. So there I am, a fat kid in red velvet knickers singing Herman's Hermits with a bad British accent. I ask you, how is it that none of my cousins ever beat me up? Now here is why this story is relevant. I am singing it on a Sunday afternoon in a house that by the standards of the late 1960s in that neighborhood could only be called exotic. Plush oriental carpets, floor-to-ceiling bookcases filled with books in a language, in alphabet I could not begin to decipher, and my grandmother's beautiful, intricate, ornate Armenian lacework everywhere. And if that house was exotic by the standards of a little boy in the late 1960s, it was certainly exotic by the standard of a little boy in the 1930s. My father. My father, of course, grew up in that house. When he started kindergarten in 1934, he couldn't speak a word of English because behind the brick walls of that monolith, my favorite of all of the homes I or anyone in my extended family ever lived in when I was growing up, everyone spoke Armenian. So my father made a decision. He was going to reinvent himself. He was going to become as American as he possibly could. I was 14 years old before I discovered he still spoke Armenian. In the 1950s, he in fact became that most iconic of mid-20th century American business professionals, a New York City ad man. A madman. Think Don Draper. That is how extensive my father's reinvention was. In 1988, he retired to South Florida. In 2009, his health began to fail. And if there was a blessing to be found among the myriad ailments and illnesses that dogged my father the last 2 years of his life, it was this. He and I spent lots more time together. Especially the last year of his life, I would fly down from Vermont to South Florida every 3 weeks or so to check in with him to see how he was doing, to meet with his doctors. When we'd feel up to it, we would hit a bucket of golf balls. But very often, we would pass the time by looking at the old family photographs, such as this one. This is the oldest photograph in the Bohjalian family. Constantinople, late 19th century, a formal family photograph. That little boy, 2 years old, sitting on his father's lap. That's my grandfather, Levon Nazareth Bohjalian. And we would look at the photograph that is my favorite of all the photographs I have of my father. It's another formal family portrait. This one taken just outside of New York City in the 1930s. It sits on a frame in my desk in Vermont. I carry it with me on my iPhone. There is just so much that I love about this photograph. There's my father in these short pants, the big wide ears, and a necktie that falls at least 2 inches above his navel. Standing beside him, elegant gray-black dress, white lapels, a corsage the size of a softball, my beautiful grandmother, Hygri. In my grandmother, I can see wisps of my beautiful 19-year-old daughter, Grace. And sitting beside them, well, there's my grandfather. He's wearing a suit. In my memory, my grandfather is always wearing a suit. I remember once asking my Aunt Rosemary, his daughter, I said, Aunt Rosemary, when I think of Grandpa, he's always wearing a suit. When you were growing up, was he always wearing a suit? And she laughed and said, no, of course not. I remember one time when he was cleaning the oil burner, he took off his jacket. Leo and Hygri Bohjalian were survivors of the Armenian genocide. Like so many survivors, they took most of their stories to their graves. We know a few details. My grandmother, her maiden name was Shodinian, and her father provided cavalry horses to the Ottoman army and had for years. In 1915, rather than acquire the horses legally as the army had for years, they simply shot him to death, confiscated the herd, and then, for good measure, confiscated the Shodinian horse farm, the townhouse in Constantinople, and all of the property within. My grandfather, he had 3 brothers. And by 1915, all 4 siblings had made it to Cairo, Egypt. They were alive. And yet somehow, between 1915 and the mid-1920s, when my grandparents wed in Paris, all 3 brothers were lost to the mists of history. We know nothing of what happened to them because my grandfather would never speak of what had happened to them. Now, the Sandcastle Girls, the novel all of you were gracious enough to read, is not the first time that I tried to write a novel of the Armenian genocide. I tried once before. It was after I'd finished writing my 4th novel, Water Witches. It was 1992 and 1993, and I finished the manuscript. 392 pages. And I remember vividly the first time I held the manuscript in my lap and started to read it and discovered it was a train wreck. Absolutely unpublishable. Moreover, it was about this time that Carol Edgarian published her completely remarkable novel of the genocide, Rise the Euphrates. And I remember thinking to myself, why in the name of heaven does anyone need my take on this story when we have the work of Carol Edgarian, Peter Balakian, and of course, Franz Werfel's magisterial epic of the genocide, The 40 Days of Musa Dam. So I took that manuscript and I sent it to my alma mater 2 hours west of here, where it exists with all my other papers in the archives. And if you are a scholar or a masochist, you can read it, but I would discourage you from doing that. This is not false humility. It's a bad book. So I think the question is this: why nearly 2 decades later did I decide to try again to write a novel of the Armenian genocide? Well, there are 3 reasons. First of all, because the story is so profoundly important. There's a direct link between the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, the Cambodian killing fields, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur. It is a very, very long list. And secondly, because today, for much of North America, the Armenian genocide is, as my narrator Laura Petrosian calls it in the Sandcastle Girls, the slaughter you know next to nothing about. Once upon a time, all North American eyes, especially this Boston area, were looking on the fraying edges of the Ottoman Empire and the slaughter of the Armenians with abject horror. People knew there were best-selling books. Best-selling books such as Bleeding Armenia. Best-selling books such as Armenian Massacres and Turkish Tyranny. Best-selling books such as this memoir, Ravished Armenia. It was a memoir by a young Armenian woman, Aurora Mardiginian. Aurora survived one of the death marches across the plains and into the Syrian desert, emigrated to the United States, penned her story, and not only was her story a best-selling book, but it became a Hollywood blockbuster silent film. 9 reels long. To this day, but 1 reel remains. And you can see that footage at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., at the Genocide Museum in Yerevan, and you can even see minutes of it on YouTube. Among the minutes that exist, and remember, this is a memoir, Hollywood's recreation of the moment from Aurora's story when she watched as some of the other women in the caravan, including her mother, were stripped naked, raped, and crucified under the searing Syrian sun. The New York Times alone ran 154 articles about the slaughter of the Armenians, most off the front page, culminating in this particular story, July 13th, 1919. It is the story of the architects of the genocide, Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, Jamal Pasha, being sentenced in absentia by a Turkish tribunal for what they called crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. Once upon a time, we all knew. But the news cycles moved on. They moved on then as they move on now. There was the rise of Nazi Germany. There was the Great Depression. The fledgling nation-state of Armenia, once a part of the American mandate, was swallowed up by the Soviet Union. And there was the 1924 Ataturk post-war Turkish government, the second post-war Turkish government. And in 1924, they began with Stalin-like determination and Stalin-esque brilliance to rewrite history. In 1915, there were roughly 2 million Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire. By the end of the First World War, all but 500,000 would be dead, systematically annihilated by their own government and their own neighbors. But the new government made it clear that this didn't happen. As a result, it took but a generation, from 1919 to 1939, for Adolf Hitler on August 22nd, 11 days before unleashing his panzers on Poland, wrote to his commanding officers the following: "Be merciless, be merciless." After all, who today remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? As a result, for most of North America today, the story of the Armenian genocide, the expungement of our civilization, exists in these sorts of images. And many of these are photographs that I took in May when I was visiting Western Armenia with Hachig Muradian. You'll hear more about Hachig in a moment. Naidi, George, Eric Nazarian, a variety of people some of you might know. This is the once magisterial church in south-central Turkey, Western Armenia, in Çanguş. These are the monasteries that dot the Lake Van basin in what was once Armenia, now eastern Turkey, desecrated, covered with graffiti and bird droppings, no sign of human habitation. Places like this, the Dudon Crevasse, where in the summer of 1915, 10,000 Armenians who lived in Çanguş were marched to the edge of the ravine, shot or bayoneted, and their bodies tossed like litter 270 feet to the chasm below, or to places like Deir Zor in Syria, where even now you can run your fingers through the sand and come away with fragments of skull and bone. So I said there was a third reason why I chose a few years ago to try once again to write a novel of the Armenian genocide. My father's health was failing, and a good friend of mine, Hachig Muradian, editor of the Armenian Weekly, renowned genocide scholar, knew that years before I had tried to write this story, he knew that my father's health was failing. And so on February 2nd, 2010, while we were having a cup of coffee at the Prudential Center a few miles from here, he looked across the wrought iron coffee table and he said, "When are you going to try again?" Not, "Are you going to try again?" but when. And if you know Hachig, you know he is nothing if not persistent. So I had my marching orders, and I decided, yes, I'm going to try to write this book before my father passes away. I knew, however, if I was going to succeed this time, I needed a personal way in. The reason why that book I tried 20 plus years ago failed is that it had no personal connection. It had no connection to my own ancestral DNA, to my grandparents, to me, to what I'd heard. It was all history, lowercase, versus history, uppercase, with both fact and heart. So this time I began by creating a female version of me. An Armenian-American novelist at midlife, Laura Petrosian, who knows far too little of her own history. And if you look at page 1 of the novel, there is Laura, 5 years old, looking at her twin brother, a fat kid in red velvet knickers, singing Herman's Hermits with a very, very bad British accent. Moreover, by writing the novel, at least in part, in the first person, I could do two things that were very important. First of all, I could provide what Laura calls the Armenian Genocide for Dummies, one of those black and yellow books, Windows for Dummies, digital printing for dummies, the Armenian Genocide for Dummies, to explain to the millions and millions and millions of people who could not find Armenia or Aleppo on a map what had occurred in 1915. But then she could also do the following. She could explain the denial. She could explain why they don't know this important part of world history and that not knowing is nothing to be ashamed of. There's a reason they never heard this story in high school, and here is what it is. But, as I said, I didn't want this to be just a history book. I wanted it to be the sort of big, sweeping, epic, and love story, a love story that I love to read. I was thinking of books like The English Patient and Corelli's Mandolin and Atonement. I've always loved love stories, and I wanted this to be one. And so who would those lovers be? Laura Petrosian's grandmother and grandfather. Her grandmother, well, she's from right here, Boston. Elizabeth Endicott, Mount Holyoke graduate, class of 1915. And why Mount Holyoke? Because Mount Holyoke, like Harvard, like Yale, like Middlebury, like Amherst, was one of the many, many New England colleges and universities that had been sending missionaries to the eastern half of the Ottoman Empire or to Constantinople since the middle part of the 19th century, and thus had befriended the Armenian community there. Mount Holyoke, it had 2 English-speaking seminaries in Western Armenia, in Beachless, in Van. So Elizabeth Endicott joins the Boston-based Friends of Armenia and journeys to Aleppo to provide aid to the refugees who have been marched into the city from the desert. But there, instead of finding refugees in the sense we envision refugees now, she sees the emaciated columns of Armenian women, the few survivors who've straggled in from the desert. It is an innermost string of Dante's Inferno beyond her worst vision. And as a matter of fact, the opening scene when Elizabeth sees the 100 women struggling into Aleppo, scorched by the sun, naked, actually comes from an actual cable that the American consul, Jesse B. Jackson, sent to the American ambassador, Mr. Morgenthau. Another 100 women came in today. Dear God, they were naked. In addition, Elizabeth finds there Armen Petrosian. Armen Petrosian is a young Armenian widower and engineer who believes he's already lost his beloved wife, Karin, and his infant daughter to the genocide. There, however, in this innermost string of the Inferno, they find each other, and against all odds, they find love. So my vision for the book is that it would move back and forth in time between 1915, and the present. And what links this century of time? One photograph. And it's a photograph that Laura sees first at the Armenian Library and Museum of America in nearby Watertown, when she's in college, and then again 2 decades later in an exhibit at Harvard. And she realizes when she sees the caption with the photograph at Harvard that this woman just might somehow be related to her. But who she is and how she wound up in Aleppo is beyond Laura's ability to fathom at first. And so that's the mystery. And as Laura unravels the mystery of that photograph, she discovers the secrets of her grandparents' magisterial love affair, as well as the secrets that they brought to their grave. Now, I have to tell you one footnote to the names in this book. There's a Winchester connection. One of my favorite characters in this book is the American consul, Ryan Donald Martin. Ryan Donald Martin is based very, very much on Jesse B. Jackson. But because we know so little of who Jesse B. Jackson was as a person, I was already thinking that I needed to come up with a fictional name because I didn't want to attribute so much personal life to this figure we know so little about, who really did exist, who really does have grandchildren or great-grandchildren living in Toronto or Ohio or Italy or some of the other places where he was stationed after he left Aleppo. Well, my daughter went to high school near here in Concord Academy. And one of her best friends is from Concord Academy. He's a young man named Ryan Donald Martin, or Ryan, as Grace, my daughter, always refers to him. One of the ways that I love to support nonprofits is to auction off character names. And at a Concord Academy fundraiser for the Financial Aid Fund, it was Ryan Donald Martin's mother and father, Donald and Martha, who ponied up the big bucks to have a character named after someone of their choosing, and they chose their son, Ryan Donald Martin. So a big shout out. I don't know if the Martins are here tonight, but if you are, thank you. And I was so glad, because doesn't that sound like an ambassadorial name? Ryan Donald Martin. It's perfect. So if I had any doubts that this was the right structure for this novel, my fears were allayed on the first of a number of trips that I've had the great privilege of taking in the last 15 months, many with Hachik, who I told you about earlier. The first of these trips, Hachik and I went together first to Beirut. And we began in Beirut for a variety of reasons. But I need to tell you something about Hachik. We are great friends. He's great friends with my wife as well. And my wife once observed that he must be the best person in the world to travel with. And I was thinking she was referring to the fact that A, he is unbelievably smart, or B, he is unbelievably generous of spirit, or C, somehow he knows every human being in the world. But she said, no, have you ever looked at his Facebook posts? And I said, yeah, and she was looking at her computer, and so I leaned over and said, look at him, he's always eating unbelievably great food, and he's always surrounded with unbelievably beautiful women. He really is the best person in the world to travel with. So we began in Beirut, and yes, we began by eating very well at a restaurant in Beirut called Medik. But the reason why we went to Beirut on this first trip is because we couldn't get to Syria because of the cataclysmic civil war. That's right, Aleppo, tragically, cataclysmically, in the news again 98 years later. The thing about Beirut, however, is there isn't simply in Antelius, the Armenian cathedral, there's also the Armenian Genocide Memorial. And when you walk into that smaller building, as I'm sure some of you have had, you are greeted by 3 walls of windows behind which are but a homeopathic fragment of those skulls and those bones pulled from the sands of Der Zor. Then it was important to go up the coast to Jabal, Biblios, to the Bird's Nest orphanage. Orphanages sprung up across the Middle East in the wake of the genocide. Essentially, that's why there are such large Armenian communities in Cairo, and Jerusalem, in Tehran, in Baghdad, in Beirut, and Aleppo, and Damascus, and Jabal. The Bird's Nest Orphanage was founded by the Danish missionary Maria Jacobsen. Maria is credited with saving at least 3,400 Armenian boys and girls on her own. How did it get the name the Bird's Nest? She was looking at a photograph of herself giving candy to the children, still skeletal from their deprivations in the desert, and she is said to have remarked, "Look at them. Look at them. They're like baby birds, and I'm like a mama bird." And the name Bird's Nest stuck. And it has become important to make those trips. You saw some images from Western Armenia. You saw the Dudon crevasse looking down. This is looking up at the Dudon crevasse. When I was there just last May, again with Hachig, as well as 5 other pilgrims, some from this very area, we went to the crevasse and we went to the town of Changush, which once upon a time had those 10,000 Armenians. Now, as far as we know, it is 100% Kurdish. No Armenians live there. But as we were leaving the village, a Kurdish gentleman in his early 60s knocked frantically on the door of our van, and he said we had to come meet his mother-in-law. His mother-in-law, he said, was 98. All of us instantly did the math. It's 2013. She was born, that means in 1915. So we went. And there, Hachig interviewed her and elicited from her her story. And as one of the other editors of the Armenian weekly, Nairi was holding her hand, as Georgia Jayan's daughter Sarah was holding her other hand, Hachig interviewed her, and she told her story as it had been told to her by her mother. In 1915, she'd been an infant in her mother's arms, the edge of the crevasse, her mother expecting to die, her husband already dead. A Turkish soldier, however, thought she was beautiful and pulled the mother from the line, married her, and raised that little girl as his own. And today, at 98 years old, she's still alive, the last living Armenian in Changush. And here's why this story is especially powerful. As Hachig was interviewing her, as Naidi and Sarah were holding her hands, she kept looking around saying, "You're Armenian. You're really Armenian." And that's when I got it. Her son-in-law was a good man, a very, very good man. It wasn't that he wanted us to meet her. He wanted his mother-in-law, 98 years old, to see Armenians before she died. It's become increasingly important as a result of the Sandcastle girls for me to return to Armenia, to Mother Armenia, to visit the genocide memorial, to stand for the eternal fire, lay flowers in the memories of the 1.5 million, as well as to visit the extraordinarily beautiful monasteries and churches that, because they are in the nation state of Armenia, have not been desecrated, have not been destroyed, such as Geghard, and to light candles for the Sharinian and the Bohjalian families, and of course to visit the statue in Yerevan for Pulitzer Prize-winning, Fresno-born Armenian-American playwright, short story writer William Saroyan, and yes, to stand before the statue. I may not be able to write as well as Saroyan, but you can't know how reassuring it is to know that I have his hairline. And increasingly, to spend time with the children of Armenia. This is a photograph from August when I was visiting a school in Karakurt. Why are the students, the high school and middle school students, dressed that way? Because they knew my interest in theater, and so they showed me a piece of unbelievably powerful, unbelievably interesting, devised, and I use that term carefully because my daughter is a young actor and talks with great importance of the importance of devised work. Basically, it's a play they wrote themselves, experimental, interesting, so powerful, and so moving to see the work. This is the future of the Armenian nation, and these kids rock. And it's really powerful to be an Armenian American and to visit Republic Square, downtown Yerevan, and to watch the fountains dance to the Komitas classical music, especially on a Saturday night, and to stand at this corner, just another corner, except for the fact it's the corner of a Bohjalian and Adam. Bohjalian, first great modern Armenian novelist, and Adam, that was my father. Now, this presentation is called We Are Still the Mountain. And the reason for that is because of a book I alluded to that was also instrumental in the creation of the Sandcastle Girls. And that is this book, The 40 Days of Musa Dagh. It was my Odar mother who, when I was growing up, made sure that I was reading Michael Arlen and William Saroyan and, of course, The 40 Days of Musa Dagh. For those of you who don't know the story, here's the Reader's Digest condensed version. In July of 1915, the Turkish army and Turkish gendarmes came to the mountain of Musa Dagh, which is in the southeastern corner of what is now Turkey on the Mediterranean Sea. And they demanded that the Armenians of the 6 villages congregate in their village centers for resettlement. By this point, the Armenians had figured out that resettlement was a euphemism for annihilation. And so instead of congregating in their village centers, they took their hunting rifles and they went to the top of the mountain. The first night that the Turkish army tried to dislodge them, they did not take the Armenians seriously, with the result that the Armenians did not merely repulse the Turkish soldiers, they commandeered some of the soldiers' German-produced Krupp howitzers and a boatload of ammunition, and thus held off the Turkish army for 53 days. In September, they were completely out of food. They were almost out of ammunition. In desperation, the Armenian women had sewn together a large Red Cross distress flag, which they dangled over the Mediterranean Sea side of the mountain, praying, hoping against hope, that a passing British or French battleship might see the flag and investigate. And sure enough, a French battleship did. And when the commander, who was actually an admiral of the fleet, saw the flag, he sent in some boats to investigate. And when he learned there were 4,000 Armenians there in need of rescue, he said, that's a lot of people. Let me find out what Paris wants me to do. And he cabled Paris asking for instructions. But while he waited, he said, let me show the Turkish army what a French dreadnought can do. And he shelled the Turkish positions on the inland side of the mountain, buying the time for the essentially 3-word response from Paris the Armenians had prayed for. Rescued the Armenians. And so he did. 4,000 Armenians were rescued. And it was actually 2 decades later, but eventually they were resettled on a strip of land on what is now the Lebanese-Syrian border in the Bekaa Valley called Anjar. And because of my powerful connection to this novel, there was not a day that I was writing the Sandcastle Girls that I didn't think in some way of the 40 Days of Musa Dagh. I wanted to go to Anjar. And because I was traveling with Hachig that first visit, I was able to. I was able to go to the center of this entirely Armenian community in Lebanon and see the monument, at once a cross and a sword. To see the paintings in the church. There are not a lot of churches where it is appropriate to have an altar painting of battleships. But it is in Anjar, because never has a battleship been more of an answered prayer. Because I was with Hachig, one of the priests of the community took us in to the relics room, off the community room, and there I was able to see some of the actual hunting rifles that the men had used to defend the mountain, to see the Red Cross flag itself, and to see the canisters that had once held the ashes of the martyrs of Musadah. In 1992, the 75th anniversary of the siege of Musadah, the Anjaris painted a beautiful, beautiful, many-paneled mural in the community room of the community hall in Anjar. And there are two panels that will always stay with me. There is this panel, which is self-explanatory, and there is this panel. It's a mountain, clearly Musadah, but also more than a little reminiscent of Ararat. And there's a block with an inscription. And in Armenian, that inscription reads, "Let them come again. We are still the mountain. Let them come again. We are still the mountain." The first half, a warrior's rallying cry. The second half, it's a conscious or an unconscious reference to the diaspora. There are roughly 10 million Armenians in this world, not quite 3 million living in the nation state. The other 7 million, we live in Winchester and Watertown. We live in Beirut, in Paris, in Boston, Los Angeles, New Milford, New Jersey. We live halfway up Vermont's third highest mountain in a village called Lincoln. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because we still have our churches, we still have our language, we still have our stories, we still have our soul. We are still the mountain. I will never forget on my first visit to Armenia. I'd had great weather the whole time, but I'd never seen the 17,000-foot summit of Mount Ararat. As one of the Anjaris once said to me when we were talking about this, actually in San Francisco, he said that Ararat, she's a shy mountain. So I'd never seen the summit, and now I was going home. I was flying from Yerevan to Paris to JFK to Burlington. And I checked in at the Yerevan airport, got to Air France Gate 6. And as I stood at the big windows on that side of the airport, I was looking out at where the mountain was supposed to be. And before my very eyes, the clouds parted, and I took this photograph. There she was, Mount Ararat. And suddenly, with my camera against my chest, I was weeping. And my wife can tell you, I do not weep easily. I have the emotional depth of a mollusk. But I was weeping. I was weeping for the 1.5 million. I was weeping for my own ancestors who had perished. And I was weeping because I was done with the Sandcastle girls. I was never again going to be spending my mornings with Nevart and Hatun and Armin and Elizabeth. I was weeping because I'd finished the Sandcastle girls, the book that I know in my heart is the most important book I will ever write. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. And now it's your turn. It's your turn, and I'm happy to answer your questions about, gosh, anything. And the first question is the hardest for you and for me.
Does anybody have a question?
Yes. The question is this: what reaction have I gotten from the Turkish community to this particular novel? Couple of things. First of all, I've received absolutely no formal response from the Turkish government, from any Turkish lobbying groups. I have, on the other hand, met a number of Turkish Americans and a number of Turkish citizens in Istanbul who, as a result of the internet, as a result of the fact that you can't keep this kind of information down in the digital age, are aware of our story and understand the importance of genocide recognition. As a matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago when I was in Albany, I met two young Turkish gentlemen who literally said to me, read your book, we're sorry. I mean, and these were young men in their 20s. Now, I understand what you mean about how raw it feels to be in Istanbul. I was actually in Istanbul in May with Hachig, and Hachig and I were giving a presentation in Istanbul about the Armenian genocide. We used those two words, Armenian genocide. Hachig has actually given a speech in Ankara about the Armenian genocide. I'm beginning to get this sense that while it is still very raw, and there's still a profoundly entrenched denialist culture that is both angry and worried because they equate genocide recognition with reparations. They equate genocide recognition with the return of all of that land that once was lived on by Armenians. They equate it, as they should, with that. But more and more there are, especially young Turkish intellectuals, who in some ways I almost equate with American freedom riders in 1964, who understand there is a profound historical injustice that needs to be addressed and are really a wonderful part of the dialogue. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to see the Sandcastle Girls published by my Turkish publisher anytime soon. It hasn't happened yet. But the short answer to your question is that the formal response from the Turkish government or Turkish lobbying groups has been non-existent. And the response from Turkish Americans I've met has been generally very favorable. How did I choose the title, The Sandcastle Girls? Well, when I had finished the book, I did not have a title yet. Very often I don't come up with a title until the book is done. And my publisher, Doubleday, which I cannot thank them enough for how terrifically they championed this book, they said, this is a terrific book. We're going to put it out in July. July is where literary fiction usually goes to die. July is beach book season. If you look at, the bestseller lists that the Sandcastle Girls were on in July of 2012, the other books are by James Patterson, Danielle Steele. They're books with handcuffs on the cover. And so I knew that I had to come up with a title that was going to not scare people away in July, so I consciously steered away from 1.5 million dead in the desert. Now, I also have this theory that a book has a slightly better success of commercial success if it has a 3-word title, first word, the. Think about it. The Kite Runner, The Lovely Bones, The Da Vinci Code, The Great Gatsby, The Double Bind. So I wanted this book to have a title that was 3 words, first word, the, and that still had a authentic connection to the text. And that is why I decided to call the book The Sandcastle Girls. And I will say one more thing. Most of you have read it, so this won't ruin the ending, I don't think, but I'll still be careful. The other thing that I liked about The Sandcastle Girls is it's a juxtaposition. When Elizabeth Endicott of Boston, Mount Holyoke, and Cape Cod thinks of sand, she thinks of the sand dunes on Cape Cod. When Hatun, and boy do I love Hatun, every scene I wrote for The Sandcastle Girls with Hatun in it, I was terrified for her. I was terrified. When Hatun thinks of sand, she thinks of the desert as she's struggling into Aleppo, the desert where she saw her mother and her sister killed.
But my question is, the history between Syria and Turkey. I know they were complicit with the Turks. I thought they were independent, unless the French were. Maybe I have my history wrong. I thought the French had some sway over Syria, but obviously they were complicit with the Turks bringing the women in and using the desert. Can you elaborate on that?
No, it's a great question. Here's the Reader's Digest condensed version map. In 1915, what we now call Syria is a part of the Ottoman Empire. It's sort of the Wild West frontier, desert, uninhabitable part of the Ottoman Empire. It would be part of the French mandate after the war. But in 1915, France is at war with the Ottoman Empire. On one side, you've got, in 1915, you've got the French, you've got the United Kingdom, think of Anzac and Gallipoli, and then you've got Italy, and then you've got the Central Powers being the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Germany, and oh, by the way, also allied with France and England. In the east, you've got Imperial Russia. So there are no French in Aleppo in 1915. The French that might have been there, prior to the war, have by now left because they're at war. So it's a community of Assyrians, the Muslim community, the Armenians as they are struggling in, and there's actually a small Armenian community even before 1915. Just so you know, Hachib Muradian's book that he's writing will really illuminate for you Aleppo in 1915. Today, in what I and many Armenians view as Western Armenia, or Eastern Turkey. In 1915, those provinces had many races, but they were predominantly Armenian. But there's a large Kurdish community even then, but it was predominantly Armenian. It was a perfect example of ethnic cleansing and Lebensraum. As the Armenians were slaughtered, as they are marched southeast into Syria, quickly it filled up with Kurds, with Turkish citizens from the west who are being resettled in the east. Turkey had lost all of these Balkan wars in what is now Bulgaria and Romania prior to the First World War. And so all of these citizens are flooding into what is now Turkey proper, and they had to go somewhere. And the Talat Enver Jamal Pasha government had a conscious plan: resettle them in the east where the Armenians are once we get rid of the Armenians. It was, if you look at, and you can literally see this if you go a few miles from here to the Armenian Library and Museum of America. You can see a graph on the wall that shows the Ottoman provinces and the 1914 Armenian census and the 1922 Armenian census. And you can literally see the way those provinces were emptied of the Armenians. So now it is Kurdish. And what's really interesting is while a lot of the Kurds were complicitous in the genocide in 1915, a lot of the Kurdish community in eastern Turkey has acknowledged the horror of the genocide and what their grandparents or great-grandparents did, so much so that in the city of Diyarbakir, a Kurdish city in south-central Turkey, the municipality spent over $1 million to help completely rebuild and reconstruct the beautiful Armenian church in Diyarbakir, Sırp Geragos. And it's gorgeous. And as a matter of fact, this summer, among other events at the church, were some joint Kurdish and Armenian poetry readings and concerts.
Thank you very much. And on behalf...
Thank you so much.